In March of 2026, without anywhere near the attention it deserved, American B-2 stealth bombers dropped dozens of bunker buster bombs on deeply buried Iranian missile launchers. Not the famous 30,000-pound bomb everyone already knows about from the strikes on Fordo. Something smaller, something that gets used far more often, hits far more targets, and tells you a lot more about how this entire air campaign against Iran has actually been fought. A 2,000-pound penetrator bomb, dropped from the most expensive aircraft the United States has ever built, against a target set most people never heard about. That's the story we're breaking down today. This isn't a story about a single dramatic night over Tehran either, the way the famous Fordo strikes were. This is a story about a repeatable, sustained campaign, one that's been running in the background of this war for months, largely overshadowed by the bigger, more headline-friendly moments happening closer to Iran's capital. Understanding it properly means understanding that not every B-2 mission in this war looks like Operation Midnight Hammer, and most of them, frankly, don't. Here's what's coming. We're going to identify exactly what weapon the B-2 actually dropped in March, and why it's a completely different bomb from the one that made headlines out of Fordo. We're going to walk through what CENTCOM and the White House actually confirmed about the target, Iran's underground missile network. We're going to cover a second B-2 mission a few weeks later that went after something even more specific, a room full of Iranian commanders. And we're going to end with the target everyone's still waiting on, the one B-2 mission that, as of the most recent reporting, still hasn't happened. So stick with me, because this is a story about the bombs that already dropped and the one that still hasn't. Let's start with the weapon itself, because getting this right matters. When people hear B-2 and bunker buster in the same sentence, most of them immediately picture the GBU-57 Massive Ordnance Penetrator, the 30,000-pound bomb that made global headlines in June of 2025, when 7 B-2 Spirit bombers dropped 14 of them on Iran's Fordo and Natanz nuclear sites in Operation Midnight Hammer. That bomb is real, it's enormous, and it's still relevant to this story, but it is not the weapon involved in the March 2026 strikes we're talking about today. It's worth remembering just how much attention that June 2025 mission actually got, because it sets the baseline most people are working from when they hear about any B-2 strike on Iran. According to CBS News reporting on the Pentagon briefing that followed, the lead B-2 dropped its first 2 MOPs on Fordo at roughly 2:10 in the morning local Iranian time, and over the following 25 minutes, a total of 14 of those bombs came down across Fordo and Natanz, with Tomahawk missiles striking Isfahan separately. General Dan Kane told reporters at the time that American forces retained the element of surprise throughout the mission, noting that Iran's fighters never got airborne, and its surface-to-air systems apparently never even detected the incoming aircraft. More than 125 aircraft supported that single mission in total, according to Kane's own accounting, an enormous commitment of resources for a strike built around just 14 bombs. That's the operation most people picture when they hear B-2 and Iran together, and it's exactly why the March 2026 strikes we're covering today got so comparatively little attention, despite representing a completely different and, in its own way, equally significant use of the same aircraft. According to CENTCOM's own confirmation, the March strikes used what the command described only as 2,000-pound penetrating bombs, without publicly naming the exact designation. Defense analysis from Army recognition filled in that gap using publicly available U.S. Air Force information pointing to the GBU-31 Joint Direct Attack munition family. This munition pairs a 2,000-pound bomb body, commonly either the BLU-109 penetrator warhead or standard Mark 84, with a GPS and inertial guidance kit. That guidance kit is what turns an old-fashioned unguided bomb into a precision-guided munition capable of hitting a fixed target with accuracy measured in just a few meters, even through bad weather. The BLU-109 warhead specifically is built to punch through several meters of reinforced concrete before it actually detonates, which makes it the right tool for hardened shelters and bunker entrances, as opposed to the kind of extreme deep underground fortification that the much larger MOP was built to defeat. Think about the difference in scale for a second, because it's genuinely enormous. The GBU-57 MOP weighs 30,000 pounds, runs about 20 feet long, and according to reporting on its specifications, can travel roughly 200 feet deep into a target before detonating. The GBU-31 JDAM used in March weighs 2,000 pounds, a 15th of that. One is designed to obliterate a mountain's worth of granite protecting a nuclear enrichment facility. The other is designed to punch through a hardened bunker roof or missile silo cover. They're not different sizes of the same tool. They're different tools entirely, built for different categories of target. And the fact that the B-2 can carry either one depending on the mission is exactly why this single aircraft keeps showing up across so many completely different phases of this war. There's also a cost dimension worth mentioning here, because it explains part of why the 2,000-pound weapon gets used so much more often than its massive counterpart. According to reporting on the MOP's production history, Boeing received a $70 million Pentagon contract in 2019 to work on the weapon, followed by an updated contract worth more than $77 million in 2021. And the exact per-unit cost has never been fully disclosed, though it's understood to run into the tens of millions of dollars each. A standard GBU-31 JDAM kit, by comparison, costs a small fraction of that, generally in the range of tens of thousands of dollars per unit rather than millions, because it's built around a mass-produced guidance kit bolted onto an existing, widely stocked bomb body rather than a purpose-built exotic weapon manufactured in extremely limited numbers. That cost gap alone goes a long way toward explaining why the Air Force can afford to drop dozens of 2,000-pound bombs on a single target set, while the 14 MOPs used at Fordo represented a genuinely significant expenditure from a limited national stockpile. So what did CENTCOM actually hit with those 2,000-pound bombs in March? According to Army Recognition's reporting, the strikes targeted hardened underground facilities, specifically designed to protect Iran's missile forces from conventional air attack. The targets most likely correspond to elements of what analysts call Iran's underground missile network, sometimes referred to as missile cities, tunnel systems excavated into mountainous terrain and connected directly to launch positions. The strategic logic there is straightforward. If Iran can keep its ballistic missile launchers hidden inside hardened, tunneled facilities, conventional airstrikes struggle to reach them, and Iran retains the ability to roll launchers out, fire, and retreat back underground before anything can respond. Destroying the tunnels themselves, or at least the entrances and shallow sections closest to the surface, degrades that entire sheltering strategy at its source. It's worth understanding why Iran built its missile forces around this kind of underground network in the first place, because it's not a recent improvisation, it's a doctrine that predates this entire war by years. Iran has never had an air force capable of contesting American or Israeli aircraft for control of its own skies, and its air defense network, while dense in places, has repeatedly proven unable to reliably detect or intercept stealth aircraft like the B-2. Given that reality, Iranian military planners made a deliberate long-term bet decades ago that the way to preserve a credible ballistic missile deterrent wasn't to try to shoot down every incoming aircraft, but to make the missile launchers themselves nearly impossible to find and destroy in the first place by burying them deep inside mountains and connecting them through tunnel networks that could theoretically survive all but the most precisely targeted strikes. That doctrine is the entire reason a 2,000-pound bunker-buster campaign against missile cities represents such a direct challenge to Iran's overall military strategy, rather than just another isolated tactical strike. The White House confirmed the broader strategic intent directly. According to Iran International's reporting, the White House press secretary told reporters that the U.S. military was moving to dismantle Iran's missile production infrastructure, describing the B-2s as having recently dropped dozens of 2,000-pound penetrator bombs on deeply buried missile sites. Dozens. Not one demonstration strike, not a single symbolic hit. A sustained, repeated campaign specifically targeting the underground infrastructure that keeps Iran's missile forces protected and operational. That same Iran International report carried another detail worth noting, even though it's a separate thread from the bombing campaign itself. The same coverage window included reporting on Mojtaba Khamenei's emergence as Iran's new supreme leader, just 2 days after his selection was announced, with supporters gathering in several cities to show loyalty to the new leadership, while Khamenei himself remained notably absent from public view. That timing, a change in Iran's supreme leadership landing, in the exact same news cycle as confirmation of a sustained American bombing campaign against the country's missile infrastructure, gives you a sense of just how much was shifting simultaneously inside Iran during this stretch of the war, both at the very top of its political structure and deep underground in its military infrastructure. The sheer number of these facilities matters too. Iran hasn't built one or two hardened missile shelters. It's built an entire distributed network of them across multiple regions of the country, specifically so that no single strike, or even a handful of strikes, could meaningfully degrade its overall missile capability. That's exactly why the March campaign involved dozens of bombs, rather than a small, targeted handful. Dismantling a distributed network requires a distributed campaign, hitting multiple sites in sequence rather than relying on one dramatic single-night operation, the way Operation Midnight Hammer worked against the far more centralized, singular target of Fordo. Now, here's where the story gets more interesting, because the B-2's involvement in this war didn't stop at missile infrastructure. About a month later, in early April, the B-2 went after something completely different, a target defined by people rather than concrete. According to Military Times, B-2 stealth bombers flying out of Whiteman Air Force Base in Missouri conducted a 36-hour non-stop mission to drop bunker-buster bombs on an underground compound where commanders from Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps had gathered. Admiral Brad Cooper, the head of U.S. Central Command personally gave the order after intelligence indicated a concentration of senior IRGC leadership was meeting at that specific location. Think about what that represents operationally. This wasn't a strike against a fixed piece of infrastructure that sits in the same place every single day. This was a strike built around a live, time-sensitive intelligence window, a room full of senior enemy leadership gathered in one place, with the B-2 tasked to reach that target, strike it, and get out, all within the narrow period before that leadership dispersed again. A 36-hour non-stop mission from Missouri to Iran and back is an extraordinary amount of flight time to commit to a single time-sensitive target. And the fact that the mission actually launched and executed tells you how seriously CENTCOM weighed the value of that specific intelligence window against the cost of committing one of America's most expensive aircraft to it. Picture what a 36-hour mission actually requires from the two-person crew flying it, just a pilot and a mission commander, according to Military Times reporting. That's a day and a half spent inside a cramped cockpit, requiring careful physical and mental preparation, precise coordination with a chain of aerial refueling tankers along the entire route, and the kind of sustained focus that most people never have to maintain for more than a few hours at a time, let alone across a mission that spans multiple full sleep cycles. The B-2 program has always relied on this kind of endurance flying, specifically because it allows the aircraft to launch from the continental United States, rather than a forward base closer to the target, which reduces the diplomatic and logistical complications of operating from regional airfields. But it asks an enormous amount of the small crews who actually fly these missions. That same reporting window included a separate, almost cinematic detail. Cooper's directive to strike the IRGC compound coincided with an active search and rescue effort for 2 American airmen who had ejected from a fighter jet over Iranian territory just days earlier. President Trump later described that separate rescue operation in dramatic terms, telling reporters it looked like something out of a movie, given how quickly the recovery team got in and got the airmen out, adding that hundreds of personnel had been involved in the effort. 2 entirely different high-stakes operations running in the same tight window in the same theater of war gives you a sense of just how much was happening simultaneously in Iranian airspace during that specific stretch of the conflict, from a downed pilot rescue mission unfolding in real time to a separate, deliberately planned strike against senior enemy leadership meeting somewhere near Tehran or one of Iran's other major population centers. Military Times also noted something important about how the B-2 fits into the broader bomber lineup being used in this war. While the B-2 has continued playing a central role whenever a target requires either the massive GBU-57 or a more precise, harder-to-detect penetrating strike, other bombers, specifically the B-1 and the B-52, have taken on a larger share of the conventional strike missions throughout the campaign. That division of labor makes sense once you understand what each aircraft actually brings to the fight. The B-1 can carry an enormous conventional payload, up to 24 2,000-pound bombs or dozens of cruise missiles, according to Axios, reporting on a July 2026 B-1 mission against IRGC targets. But it cannot carry the GBU-57 at all, since that weapon is built exclusively for the B-2's stealth airframe and internal weapons bay. The B-52 brings similar mass conventional firepower alongside long-range cruise missile capability. The B-2 is reserved specifically for the missions that require either its stealth profile to penetrate contested airspace undetected, or its unique ability to carry the massive ordnance penetrator that no other aircraft in the American arsenal can deliver. That same July 2026 B-1 mission is worth mentioning briefly, because it shows how the broader bomber campaign kept evolving even after the specific B-2 missions we've covered today. According to Legal Insurrection's reporting on the Axios story, that B-1 strike against IRGC targets marked the aircraft's first deployment since the ceasefire that had briefly paused. The war collapsed, coming just days after Trump had signaled a possible airstrike against Pickaxe Mountain specifically. CENTCOM, around that same time, announced the completion of a 12th consecutive night of strikes against Iranian targets, covering maritime capabilities, missile and drone storage facilities, coastal surveillance sites, and air defense assets. That 12th consecutive night detail places the B-1 mission, and by extension, the renewed conversation about Pickaxe Mountain, firmly within the same sustained, grinding campaign that produced both the March Missile City strikes and the April IRGC leadership strike, rather than as some separate, disconnected escalation. And that brings us to the target still sitting out there, unstruck, as of the most recent reporting available, Pickaxe Mountain. According to the Wikipedia tracker documenting this specific facility, Pickaxe Mountain is a deeply fortified underground Iranian nuclear site, left untouched during the earlier strikes of both June 2025 and the opening phase of the 2026 Iran war. Construction on the facility reportedly began back in 2020, following an explosion Iranian authorities attributed to sabotage at the Natanz facility around that same time. Throughout July 2026, President Trump repeatedly stated the United States would target the site, telling reporters it would be hit, in his words, pretty soon and very heavily. As recently as July 21st, according to that same tracker, Israeli intelligence officials assessed that Iran may have moved sensitive material deeper into the mountain's tunnel system, suggesting Tehran itself expects this strike to eventually come. It's worth understanding why the specific facility never got touched during either of the two earlier rounds of strikes, despite years of satellite surveillance tracking its construction. Analysis from Ynet News laid out two separate explanations. The first is that the site apparently wasn't being used for actual nuclear activity, such as enrichment or weapons design work, during either of those earlier campaigns, serving instead as a storage location, which made it a lower priority target relative to facilities that were actively producing enriched material. The second reason is more logistical than strategic. Seriously damaging the tunnels running through that mountain would require an exceptionally large operation that, according to that same analysis, only the United States possesses the specific hardware to carry out, since only the U.S. Air Force operates both the roughly 10-ton GBU-57 bunker-busting bomb and the stealth B-2 bombers capable of carrying it. Israel, despite its own extensive strike campaign against Iranian targets throughout this war, simply doesn't have access to a weapon in that weight class, which is exactly why any eventual strike on Pickaxe Mountain would have to be an American operation, not an Israeli one, regardless of how the rest of the war has been divided between the two allies. But here's the part that makes Pickaxe Mountain a genuinely different problem than either of the strikes we already covered. Weapons experts have openly questioned whether even the 30,000-pound GBU-57, the largest conventional bunker buster in the entire American arsenal, could actually destroy a facility built at this specific depth beneath solid granite. Analysis from the war zone laid out exactly why targeting a site like this is so difficult, even with the most powerful weapon available. Firm intelligence on precisely where the tunnels snake underneath the mountain can be limited, which makes it genuinely hard to select the best impact points for a strike. That's exactly why the U.S. military has invested heavily for decades in advanced void-sensing fuses for the MOP and similar weapons. Fuses specifically designed to detect when a bomb is penetrated into a sufficiently large open space, like a room or a tunnel, before triggering detonation in order to maximize the damage from every single bomb dropped. Reporting from Yahoo News, drawing on assessments comparing Pickaxe Mountain to the Fordo facility, struck back in June 2025, laid out just how much more difficult this specific target actually is. The mountain above the Natanz area facility sits at roughly 650 meters, well over 50% higher than the mountain that shielded Fordo, which means potentially even greater physical protection against an aerial strike using the exact same class of weapon. A report from the Institute for Science and International Security, cited in that same coverage, found satellite imagery showing the facility has only a single ventilation shaft compared to Fordo's two. That detail matters enormously because General Dan Kane, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, explained in a June 2025 press briefing that the entire strike strategy for the 12 MOPs dropped on Fordo was built specifically around exploiting those ventilation shafts, first destroying the covers Iran had placed over them, then sending follow-up bombs directly down the now exposed shafts to penetrate deep into the heart of the facility. With only one shaft to work with at Pickaxe Mountain, that same layered targeting approach becomes considerably harder to execute. Think through what losing that second shaft actually costs a targeting team planning this kind of mission. With two ventilation shafts at Fordo, American planners had a built-in redundancy. If the approach on one shaft didn't achieve the desired penetration, there was a second independent point of entry to exploit as a follow-up. A single shaft at Pickaxe Mountain removes that redundancy entirely. Every bomb in the sequence has to work against the same single point of entry, which raises the stakes on each individual weapon's accuracy and dramatically reduces the margin for error across the entire strike package. David Albright, the president of the Institute for Science and International Security, has separately warned that Iran has been actively burying and reinforcing its tunnels and entrances at both Pickaxe Mountain and at a facility near Isfahan, meaning the target has likely only gotten harder to crack in the months since the specific vulnerability of that single shaft first became known through satellite analysis. There's also a reassuring detail buried in that same reporting, worth mentioning for balance. According to that Yahoo News analysis, the U.S. military did not rush to order a fresh batch of MOPs immediately after the June 2025 strikes on Fordo, and the orders that were eventually placed were for the same existing bomb design rather than some larger, newly developed weapon. Analysts read that as a mildly positive sign, since it suggests the Pentagon wasn't caught with a critically depleted stockpile immediately following Operation Midnight Hammer, meaning enough MOPs likely remain available for an operation against Pickaxe Mountain if and when the order actually comes. That stockpile detail matters more than it might seem at first glance, because a nation that had to wait years to rebuild its supply of a bomb, this specialized and expensive to manufacture, would face a very different decision-making timeline than one that already has a sufficient reserve sitting ready in storage. So here's how all three of these threads fit together into one coherent picture. In March, the B-2 used 2,000-pound penetrator bombs to systematically dismantle Iran's underground missile launcher network, a target set that needed precision and volume rather than maximum destructive depth. In April, the B-2 used its bunker-busting capability again, this time against a live, time-sensitive human target, a gathering of senior IRGC leadership meeting in an underground compound. And sitting out there, still unstruck as of the most recent reporting, is Pickaxe Mountain, a target so deep and so well protected that even the largest conventional bomb in the American arsenal faces open. Documented questions about whether it can actually finish the job. That progression tells you something important about how this entire air campaign has actually been sequenced. The B-2 hasn't been reserved for one singular use. It's been used across an entire spectrum of target types, from repeatable high-volume strikes against missile infrastructure to precision time-sensitive strikes against enemy leadership, all building toward what may eventually be the single most difficult bunker-busting mission the United States has ever attempted. Each of the strikes that already happened, the missile launcher network in March, the IRGC leadership compound in April, demonstrates a version of this capability that worked. Pickaxe Mountain is the one still sitting on the table, threatened repeatedly and publicly by the president himself, but not yet executed. And every piece of technical analysis available suggests that whenever that mission finally happens, it will be operating at the very edge of what America's most powerful conventional weapon can actually accomplish. What do you think happens with Pickaxe Mountain? Does the U.S. commit to a strike despite the documented uncertainty about whether even the GBU-57 can finish the job at that depth? Or does the target sit there, threatened but unstruck, the way it has since construction began back in 2020? Let me know what you think happens next. Every claim in this video traces back to named, verifiable reporting. CENTCOM's own confirmations relayed through Army Recognition's technical analysis, Iran International's coverage of the White House's public statements, Military Times' reporting on the April IRGC leadership strike, Axios reporting on B-1 deployments carried through legal insurrection, the War Zone's technical analysis of the Pickaxe Mountain targeting challenge, the Wikipedia trackers for the GBU-57 MOPE, and for Pickaxe Mountain specifically, and Yahoo News' comparative analysis of Pickaxe Mountain against the Fordo strike, where capability remained genuinely uncertain, including whether the largest bomb in the American arsenal can actually defeat this specific target. That uncertainty was presented as uncertainty, not resolved into false confidence in either direction.